Now we'll talk about elements of culture. Every culture relies on certain elements to provide its people with the way to live. Language is a set of symbols and rules, when put together, provide a meaningful way of us being able to communicate. It provides a complex communication system. Language permeates almost everything we do. Language is involved in both mundane and extraordinary events in our lives. Language influences how we see or perceive the world around us. We are more likely to be aware of things if we have words for these items. Human culture is made possible by language. Language shapes our world so much that culture has rules about language, not just about spelling, grammar, or sentence structure, but also about what languages are accepted and if foreign languages can be used. Some society prohibits people from speaking non-official languages because they are deemed a threat to their culture. All cultures use speech as a vehicle for communication, and many others have written or some system of marks that represent spoken word. Written language or text can be passed from culture to culture and from generation to generation in ways that speech cannot. Learning the language of a culture is essential in becoming a part of that society. Sapir and Whorf hypothesis basically says that language determines what people think and perceive because language shapes one perception of reality. If this is correct, then speakers of a different language have a different perception of reality. There is no disagreement that language has a strong influence on culture. Language and culture shape each other. Think about Americans and the way that we divide our week into two parts. We have weekdays and we have weekends. When does the week end? For some of us, the week may end on a Friday. For other of us, it may end on a Wednesday, or possibly a Monday if you work different shifts. What does the weekend mean? For some of us, it means time to rest, play, chores, hang out with family. For other of us, it could mean that it's time for us to start our work day or our work week. Some of us look forward to the weekends because of the fact that we can relax. Others of us may prepare for it as a work week. Social inequality is also in language. Patterns of race, gender, and class inequality are reflected in language. The names of various racial and ethnic groups imposed an identity on individuals within those groups. Sociologists call this labeling. It is placing an identity on a group. The group did not choose a certain name, but society, typically the dominant culture, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit, are the ones who are able to place these labels or this identity on a group. This is one of the reasons why there have been debates from different racial and ethnic groups as to how they identify and which names they select to be called. Language can reproduce racist and sexist thinking. By changing the language people use, we can alter social stereotypes and change the way people think. Power relationships between groups supply the social context for connotations of language. For example, in the Jim Crow South, black men, regardless of their age, were called boy, which is an insult calling a grown man boy. It diminishes his status. Also, calling a young woman girl has the same effect. Young women were often referred to as girls by their male bosses. Seeing this power dynamic play out can kind of illustrate the fact that, once again, it diminishes her status. However, there are some terms that are offensive when used by others outside, can be derogatory, but when used by someone with the same power or within the same community, it is no longer offensive. It is the idea that they are reclaiming them as positive within their own culture. Norms are specific cultural expectations that govern behavior in situations. They are implicit. It does not need to be spelled out. For example, when you join a line, you know that you should stand behind the last person. Some norms are explicit, which means that they do need to be spelled out. There are two types of norms. You have folkways and mores. Folkways are general standards of behavior adhered to by a group. There's no moral underpinning when it comes to folkways. Folkways may be loosely defined and adhered to, but they structure group customs and govern much of society. How you dress, the way people greet each other, prepare their food, the way that you may be clean, or your hygiene. Mores are strict norms, and they have moral underpinnings that control moral and ethical behavior. Mores are often held up through rules or laws in society. Violating mores can bring serious consequences. Laws are basically formalized mores. Social sanctions are mechanisms of social control that enforce norms. Rewards and punishment are metered out when one violates a cultural norm. Laws are written as a set of guidelines that define right or wrong in a society. Sanctions can be positive or negative. For example, if I violate a social sanction, what can happen to me, particularly if it's a formal social sanction, is I may receive some type of punishment within society. If it's an informal social sanction and I violate that, normally what may happen is I may get reprimanded or maybe receive a verbal reprimand. Taboos are those behaviors that bring the most serious sanctions. Those are things that you would not do in any type of society. Ethnomethodology is a theoretical approach in sociology based on the idea that you can discover the normal social order through disrupting it. Ethnomethodologists deliberately disrupt social norms to see how people respond and try to reinstate social order. So, for example, if I were to get into the elevator and decide that I wanted to start having a conversation with a stranger, or if the elevator's not crowded, but I stand right up next to a stranger, right? That would be considered me breaching or me disrupting the norm. Or, just like I mentioned that most of us know that when you get in line, you go into the back of the line. Well, what happens if I decide to cut the line, right? And that would illustrate a disruption in the norms. Beliefs are shared ideas held collectively by people within a given culture about what is true. Belief stems from religion, myth, folklore, or science, providing a meaning system around which cultures organize. Some beliefs are strongly held that people find it difficult to cope with ideas or experiences that contradict them. Beliefs provide a meaning system about which culture is organized. Values are going to be abstract standards that define a culture or society's ideal principles. They can be basis for cultural cohesion or source of conflict. Values define what is considered right or wrong, beautiful and ugly, good and bad. In U.S., freedom is a value we uphold. But what exactly is freedom? Values can be a source of cohesion in society, but it can also be a source of conflict in society. For example, should the government play a role in the provision of health care? Should public schools allow school prayer? Values, beliefs, and norms guide and regulate the behavior of people in society. The dominant culture is going to be the group in society that has the most power. This does not mean that they are the largest in number, okay? The culture of the most powerful group in a given society, they're the ones that set the cultural expectations that constitute the culture or society's major belief. This is not the only culture of society, but the culture by the most powerful group in society. These expectations are supported by major social institutions. The dominant culture often sets the standards by which other cultures and societies are judged. Middle-class values, habits, and economic resources are typically seen as the dominant culture as far as setting, the dominant culture within our society. Okay. This culture is strongly influenced by instruments of culture such as television, fashion, Anglo-European traditions. The U.S. culture emphasizes achievement and individual efforts, which goes back to when we talk about the middle class. Subcultures are grouped within the larger culture whose values and norms of behavior differ from those of the dominant culture, yet they share many elements of the dominant culture and coexist with it. Subcultures may have different terminology, customs, and practices. Some subcultures retreat from the dominant culture. Subcultures often develop when new groups of immigrants enter a society. So a subculture would be maybe persons who are Puerto Ricans in New York City. That would be considered a subculture. And I always explain subcultures as the fact that they still kind of go with the rules with the dominant culture, but they have their own rules, and it doesn't contradict that dominant culture. Countercultures, on the other hand, are subcultures created as reaction against the values of the dominant culture. Some subcultures form because of the lack of power they may have in society. Often society's youth will form countercultures. So sometimes we may see countercultures, particularly in the 60s, the hippies were seen as a counterculture because they went against the values of the dominant culture. Also, the punks, what was a movement in England, they went against, or Great Britain, they went against the dominant culture there. Some countercultures, like contemporary militia movements, directly challenge the dominant political system. There are countercultures which may be in response to repressive government and may force some groups to go underground. So just remember that subcultures, they don't go against the dominant culture. They kind of exist within that dominant culture, whereas countercultures go against many of the values of that dominant culture. Ethnocentrism is the habit of seeing things only from the point of view of one's own group, in contrast to cultural relativism. Ethnocentrism perspective prevents you from understanding the world as others experience it, and it can lead to narrow-minded conclusions about the worth of diverse cultures. Ethnocentrism has a dual nature. It can build group solidarity, and it can create prejudice and discrimination. It can lead to conflict, overt political conflict, war, terrorism, even genocide. So when you watch the film God Grew Tired of Us, you may see elements of ethnocentrism within that film. In fact, you should see elements of ethnocentrism where one group is basically trying to get rid of another group because they believe that their culture is the best. Okay. How can people believe so much in their religious faith that they would murder people? And that would be ethnocentrism. That's the key answer. Any group can be ethnocentric. Cultural relativism is the idea that something can be understood and judged only in relations to the cultural context in which it appears. So, for example, if you see maybe, for example, people eating with utensils, right, or eating with their hands, that I may be ethnocentric and say, oh, that's gross, or how do you do that? That's different. Why would you do that? Or I may say that may be seen as someone that's uncivilized. However, if I step back and I use cultural relativism, then I can understand, oh, the reason why they eat with their hands is because that's a part of their culture. And it means that they're sharing their food with each other, that type of thing. So it allows me to kind of understand or judge that culture based off of their cultural standards. Xenocentrism is the belief that another culture is superior to one's own. And that's basically the idea that if I go and maybe I get immersed in another culture, I think that culture is better than my own culture. And so I would only look at the negative aspects within my culture and only the positive aspects within that other culture and compare it that way. Global culture is the diffusion of a single culture throughout the world, and Western culture was seen as the one that was going to be considered that one single culture throughout the world. However, I do believe that this is kind of changing a little bit. When we think of this global culture, one of the examples that I give is I say, think about the fact that you can find McDonald's in almost every nation, right? And even the way that McDonald's operates, fast food based off of a line, based off of the way that they do things, that would be considered an aspect of global culture. One of the problems with the idea of global culture is it would create a homogeneous world culture where everything is the same. Some worry that posing Western values on non-Western culture erodes long-held cultural traditions.